Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. We're going to get going in about a minute's time, but just allow people to find their way in. But as we're waiting, it'd be really great if everybody could start introducing themselves in the chat and where they're calling in from. Okay, and so since it's 1:01, I'm ready to get going so that we can make most of the time that we have together. So I'll start out by saying hi to everyone and welcome back to season 6 of the Democracy Dialogues. I'm Victoria Kuketz, and I am so proud to be able to host this series with the Democratic Engagement Exchange. And so it's just really great to be back together to discuss some of the persistent challenges to Canadian democracy and what we as a collective sector can do about them. So for those of you who have joined us in past sessions, welcome back. And for anyone newly joining us, we really appreciate you being here and joining our community. I would say that right now, geopolitical events seem to be moving at light speed, especially with the Canadian election in full swing. We're all talking about it, we're all buzzing over it, and the social conditions in this election as it unfolds are really quite exceptional, with the tensions from the United States looming over all of us as well. But I think it's fair to say that Canadians are awake and really hungry for information and what it all means for their daily lives and our collective futures. But with that, we have some serious challenges to face when it comes to seeking truth. And that's the question we're asking today. Does it still exist, or is it a dead concept? Just a few thoughts are that, many are avoiding the news right now to stave off anxiety. Others are relying on social media for their updates, but are inundated with mis and disinformation and can't access traditional media because of Meta's news ban and struggles to implement the Online News Act. Some seek out news that affirms their already deeply held beliefs, which is compounded by algorithms and filter bubbles doing the very same thing. And there are a whole series of local and foreign actors who are deeply invested in information manipulation to embed narratives that influence social relations and even elections. So this begs the question that we've gathered here today to ask: is the truth a dead concept? Was it ever perfectly real to begin with? So these are the questions we'll explore today, and also continue this conversation more broadly as the exchange prepares to host the Canadian Vote Summit on May 20th and 21st in Montreal. And I'm just going to ask my colleague Ashley to share the link that, this is really the beginning, and then there'll be an entire conference dedicated to this at the end of May. So we hope you can join us in community. Before we get going, I actually want to get a bit of a sense of how all of you are feeling about this question. So my colleague Ashley is going to put up a couple of poll questions. Ashley, can you pull up the polls, please? Okay, so want to hear from you. Is the truth a dead concept? I would love for you to weigh in. I think we should start to get a couple answers in a moment there. The second question we have is, I am able to find verified information online. Number 3, I'm interested in finding verified information online. And number 4, I prefer to read journalism that validates my views. So thanks to all of you who are weighing in. About 10% of you say that the truth is a dead concept. About 93% of you say no, so thank you for that hope. 93% are saying you can find verified information online, with about 18% of you sharing that you can't. Number 3, I'm interested in finding verified information online, 100% of you. So I think that's a really important data point for us. And this one's a little bit more split. I prefer to read journalism that validates my views. So 67% of you saying yes, and 33% of you saying no. So thank you for that early on engagement. And we really want to keep your voices centered in this conversation as well. So I'm really excited to share that we have Canada's leading fake news expert, Craig Silverman, joining us in conversation today. And I'm excited to welcome him in a moment. But first, I'd like to offer a land acknowledgement. So today we're meeting virtually. You may not be on the same ground as me. I'm currently in Toronto, which is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Huron-Wendat, and Mississaugas of the New Credit. So instead, please join me in acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands we're on today, and to reflect on their importance. And I want to reflect on this in the context of truth for a moment as well. So in Canada, the process of truth and reconciliation reminds us that truth is not a choice. It's a responsibility. Truth is not dead in this regard, but has too often been buried beneath silence, denial, and erasure. As we reflect on whether truth still holds meaning in a fragmented world, we must center the truths Indigenous communities have always carried of land theft, of residential schools, of resistance, and of survival. These truths are not opinions or perspectives, they're lived realities. So, to move forward in reconciliation, we must first commit to upholding truth, not as a political convenience, but as a moral imperative. So, with that, I'd like to welcome Craig to join me. Hi, Craig. How are you?
Hey, I'm good. Thank you so much for having me.
It's such a pleasure to have you here. And I know we're going to be asking a pretty tough question, but I know it's one that you've really centered your whole life and career on. So, with that, we know you've been at the forefront of reporting on mis and disinformation for years. But when you hear this question, so, bluntly stated, is the truth as we know it dead? What is your quick reaction?
So my quick reaction is that, one, I like sort of sigh and gather myself like, okay, here we go. We're going down this road. But also my initial reaction is to say no. And my reason for saying no is that I think that we have a very complicated information ecosystem and relationship with the truth and with facts, and the ecosystem and sense of learning overall. But I also think that if we look back without rose tinted glasses, we can always see a complicated relationship with the truth. And so I don't think that the truth is dead. And I don't think that truth as we know it is dead in the sense that we should probably know truth as always having been, in some cases, very personal, very complicated, very contextual, where you are, who you are in your life and all those things. And so if anything, maybe by so many people now feeling like a little bit unmoored and feeling like we're losing touch with the truth, maybe it actually, and this is me being my most rose tinted glasses, we have an opportunity to actually, re-engage and rethink what that relationship, could have been in the past, but especially is now. And so, so I think that we have a lot of work to do. There's a lot about this moment that, it makes me feel very pessimistic. But when it comes to this, and when it comes to being able to have a gathering like this around this topic where people who are clearly engaged on it, that makes me kind of optimistic, that maybe we can actually navigate and find our way to perhaps a more realistic relationship with it.
I think that's a really helpful bit of framing for our audience. And I'm just wondering if we can maybe break it down a little bit more as well. So I think it's fair to say that, and actually, it'll be interesting to see if you agree with this. We have objective truths, right? Like gravity exists, climate change is real. There are people who deny this, but the question of whether or not that is true, like it is. We can have denialists. And then we have, shared social truths, which I think is a little bit more at risk, right? Is this what happened in the election? Can this source be trusted? It seems like we're in shakier territory there. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I think, the sort of ground truths that you mentioned, gravity and climate change, there's definitely efforts to undermine those and question those. And in the case of the latter, an extremely well-funded, effort across many different places and disciplines and what have you. And so definitely, I think are examples of things like that under attack. I mean, think about the measles vaccine, which is like perhaps one of the greatest medical interventions that we've had over the last
Mhm.
century or so. And there are people, literally whose children have died in the United States who are arguing that, they're happy that their child didn't get it. And so I think that's one of the things that makes a lot of people feel like we are losing touch, right? And so I think that there's a lot of examples of really big fundamental challenges in those areas. And then the sort of social truths of my understanding and my view versus someone else's and how I'm sort of making sense of the world. That has always, I think, been the place where we typically see the most kind of divergence. Because at the end of the day, all of us going through this universe and this spinning rock within it, I mean, we're all trying to make sense of a wide variety of things, from the macro of like why we are here and what is the point of existence, to the micro of this decision I need to make today in my life. And I think one of the points of frustration for a lot of people is that, how do we make good decisions individually but also collectively if we're not able to agree on really big things that are well documented and proven, like climate change? And it's probably the relationship between those two that makes things feel a little bit different. Like when I think a lot about climate change, I remember back, I think it was in the 80s when, there was sort of the acid rain issue, and you had actually like a Republican in the White House, and you had conservative governments in Canada and the U.S. and other places who recognize that this is probably something we need to sort of deal with, and so that's where I think we can look sometimes back on nostalgia of like, there were times where actually you could sort of transcend some of the things. But today, some of the great things about our media environment, about it being more open and more democratized, really embolden the people and the forces who would like to kind of work and undermine, but also just influence and gather people to their point of view. And that's where a lot of kind of the battle is taking place, I think, on both of those fronts that you kind of talked about.
That's an interesting point too. I was just reading some of Samara Center for Democracy's really interesting reporting on their new Verified project. And they actually talked about, the power differentials of outsized voices and the amount of influence they hold, and really just kind of getting into what you've been sharing there. But I want to go, and I do want to talk about that, but I want to go a little bit earlier. And because you have been like a leading voice in this area for a really long time. So I'm just wondering, was there a moment, in the past like 10 to 15 years with the rise of social media, when you were at either BuzzFeed or ProPublica, where something just kind of cracked open for you? And when you realized the truth maybe wasn't as straightforward anymore and that we were headed towards crisis?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there were kind of two moments for me, and actually they kind of predate joining BuzzFeed or joining ProPublica. So for me, the path that I ended up sort of in this world of disinformation and trying to sort of fact check and verify, and the dynamics of the information environment. It started. I promise I won't make this long, but like back in 2004. I was a freelance journalist based in Montreal, and I just started a blog because blogs were still kind of new at the time. And I was like, okay, I want to start something. And I started a very nerdy blog about verification and fact checking and corrections in journalism. So 2004 well predates social media, but sort of blogs were starting to kind of crack these sort of mainstream elements of journalism and media, which was mostly mainstream newspapers, radio, TV, that kind of thing. And so I just started getting really nerdy about like why journalists make mistakes, how we're supposed to correct them, but also how do we figure out whether we know something or not. And so that I did that for like roughly about 10 years, that blog. But as we start to get Facebook, and as we start to get to about the 2012 to 2014 period, I mean the challenge of verifying information becomes way different, because now suddenly something that a newsroom might have had hours or days to sort of figure out and then decide what to publish, information is now already on Twitter or it's already on Facebook. And so suddenly newsrooms had to think about, well, how do we deal with like things that are already spreading and people are already being exposed to? We don't get the luxury of it coming to us and then us deciding like word of God what to say about this. And so one example of that was there's a researcher. He actually went on to work at BuzzFeed later years, named Gilad Lotan. And I remember he did an analysis of a whole bunch of Twitter accounts, just tweeting about a particular event. And he saw elements in them that he thought were deceptive and that they were sort of seemed to be coordinated and sharing basically the same messages. And he ended up figuring out that they were fake accounts and that he could, probably go out and buy his own fake accounts. And so he did an experiment where he bought fake accounts and saw where they, what accounts they gave him and who those accounts followed, and did a whole analysis to show this massive network of completely fake accounts that you could basically buy or rent on Twitter. And that kind of blew my mind. I was like,
Mhm.
oh, wow, this is a service. The voices that we could see and now suddenly feel like we're close to that event happening because it's people there. Well, the ability to fake that is so easy. And then the second one was when I was doing a research project around kind of rumors spreading online in 2014. Was I started coming across websites that they looked like news websites. They looked like it could be a newspaper or whatever, but everything on them was 100% false.
Hmm.
And they had ads all over the websites, and they existed basically to figure out what kind of false headlines and articles they could come up with that they could then share on Facebook and have them go viral, which would make, people sharing them, clicking on the links, going back to their website to earn money. And I remember the one that really drove me crazy was in the fall of 2014, there was a real Ebola scare of whether it would make its way to the US and to Canada. And one of these sites called National Report wrote an article saying that an entire town in Texas had been quarantined because of an Ebola case. And it was made up. The journalist's name was fake, their bio was fake, the story, everything was made up. And I just sort of looked at it, and this thing was, getting serious traction on social media, and realized, this is a scenario where the more outrageous, the more extreme, the more false something is, people are not able to find the signals to sort of discern it. And in fact, the algorithms on Facebook are helping these things take off like crazy. I mean, stories like that and others, we're getting hundreds of thousands or millions of shares and likes and comments on Facebook. And I watched that all through the fall of 2014 during this research. And that sort of was for me like, oh my God, we have a fundamental problem here about the way these platforms are choosing what to elevate and what to expose people to.
That's really interesting. I have a couple follow-up questions for you. What do we do in an environment where fiction is just more interesting than fact?
Yeah, and I think to a certain extent that's probably usually been the case in human existence. Like
Mhm.
the stuff we can make up when we have no boundaries, and standards around it. I mean, that's why novels and films and everything are so wonderful and entertaining. But you take that element of us loving a great story or loving information, as you sort of mentioned in your intro, that aligns with what we already believe, what we already feel we know, that makes us feel good about what we know too, that reinforces like, yes, I was right. I mean, every human loves that reaction, right?
Mhm.
So when you have that and then it collides with these massive sort of socio-technical systems that are choosing basically what gets engagement and what doesn't, that's where, if they don't sort of set themselves up and put in, policies and encode things in it where they are choosing what to elevate and thinking about things like accuracy and reality, well, then the fake stuff is probably always going to win because it is more interesting. It appeals to base kind of natural human information consumption truths, and it's going to win. And that was really the case on Facebook between, I guess, about 2010 and the end of 2016, when Facebook was really trying to make news something that people would get and engage with there, and politics something to get and engage with. But they didn't actually think about, well, what do we want to value? For them, it was just like whatever people want, let's just let them do. And so the end result was, yeah, the fake stuff, the false stuff, the too good to be true tales worked well because we love them. They're appealing, right?
Absolutely. And that's an interesting tension between kind of short-term gain and reward and the long-term thinking and the long-term behavioral affect we've seen as a result of all of this. I have two more kind of like rapid fire questions for you. But you were talking about bots. And I remember this kind of being, an early influencer thing where people wanted to be able to make, careers out of being broadcasters or salespeople or all this kind of stuff. So people were buying bots left, right, and center. I think we've seen that evolve quite a bit for bots to be instrumentalized as like, elements of agents of foreign interference and so many other things. So the question is, do you think bots should be illegal because essentially they are fraudulent?
Yeah, and I think like there's a few categories of sort of like inauthentic accounts. Like a bot would be one that is automated and controlled by software, telling it what to post, when to post, and just sort of going off. And now with AI models like ChatGPT, those automated systems could have conversations with people, and you'd never know that it was automated
Mhm.
potentially. But there's also ones often referred to as sock puppets, where it's real humans running accounts, but the accounts are not what they claim to be. So they have stolen profile photos or AI generated profile photos, and they're basically a network to spread or engage with people in a certain way. And so I think for me personally, I wouldn't necessarily endorse just outright banning any automated account. There are examples of good
Interesting.
automated accounts. There are. I mean, one of my favorite old school Twitter accounts was one where people would sort of misuse a phrase. And I'm trying to remember what it was. It was they would say peak PEEK instead of PEAK, and I'm trying to remember what it exactly was. And basically, it was a bot that would search on Twitter for any time someone misused that particular phrase and would automatically send them a sort of, note correcting them, which is a very pedantic,
Yes.
fact checker thing to sort of enjoy. But I mean, look, there are automated accounts that give earthquake alerts and things like that. So I think automated accounts aren't inherently bad, but accounts that are masquerading as something that they're not, accounts that, pretend to be, say, a public figure, a politician, or, those kinds of things, there are rules against those on most platforms. But, one of the challenges that these platforms have is they are so big. Like, there is nothing that has ever existed in the history of human communication in terms of like a Facebook or a TikTok or even a Twitter, which is much smaller, in terms of the amount of content, the engagement, the amount of people on them. And so they can have whatever policies they want. The question is, do they have the resources and ability to actually enforce them? And so they've got a lot of policies that are good around impersonated and fake and false engagement and all that, but they can't enforce them at the scale they need to actually have, necessarily like a level of certainty about it. So yeah, I don't mind the actual automated bots, but I think what you want to do is create signals for the audience to know that that is an automated account, and those are labels that have been put on some platforms saying, hey, this is an automated account, which is a helpful signal, I think, for people to have.
Yeah, thank you for helping me evolve my own thinking about it. Because before coming to this conversation, I was ready to draw an absolute line of I think bots should just be illegal or at least restricted. One other question for you about kind of the historical long view, and then I'm going to bring us back into the present. I remember that time as thinking that this, was a really democratizing technology and that anybody could be a broadcaster. And that was really exciting, especially with, what people thought was the end of journalism around the financial crisis as well. Do you think anyone should be able to be a broadcaster? Is that actually helpful in 2025?
I think it is. I don't think it's something we want to restrict. And this goes to some of the debates that we've had in journalism for a long time, is that, you really, like, you can't be certified as a journalist. It's not like a doctor or whatever, where it's like, well, you're a practicing journalist or you're not. And that's because at the core of it, there's elements of free expression and really fundamental rights in a democratic society. And so I don't think we want to stop people from being able to express and from being able to, plane crashes in their neighborhood. I wouldn't want to stop somebody from holding up their phone and showing, the emergency crews responding or things like that. And so, the risk for me is, well, how do we actually write rules around that don't get abused for censorship? Because if you look in the US right now with the administration, obviously they are cracking down in a variety of ways
Mm-hmm.
on press, on universities. And so if you have laws on the books that make it easier for people to do things like that for different motivations than it was originally created, you can imagine how a law sort of preventing anybody from being a broadcaster suddenly prevents anybody from doing independent reporting, and it's only state sponsored or what have you mouthpieces in an autocratic regime. And so I think, like, we have to accept that the cat's out of the bag on that. We all have these amazing broadcast devices in our pockets. And so it's really then thinking like, okay, if this is reality, what are the things we could do to help kind of encourage people who are filming and doing what have you to sort of do so in a responsible way, but also people consuming to take our responsibility. And one of the things you said, I think, early on, you were talking about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and things like that. I mean, you talk about how there's a certain responsibility we all have around it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that responsibility is bigger now for all of us than in the previous media environment that was much more orderly and smaller and had fewer voices. It was kind of easier to navigate. And today we have much more responsibility for all of us as consumers and producers about what we do, what we share, but also what we are consuming.
That's really interesting. I wonder if it'd be interesting to do a poll to see if the majority of people actually feel that they should take responsibility. So that's maybe one that we can bookmark for finding out later. I think where I want to take the conversation now is, as we know, disinformation doesn't float in a vacuum. It often serves power and powerful aims. So whether it's political, social, or economic, how do you see misinformation being used as a tool to shape or distort influence right now? Is there a clear villain here, bad actors pulling the strings, or is the truth about that more complicated and more systemic? And as a part two to that question, since we're in a federal election period, what kind of patterns or red flags are you seeing that might speak to our own nation's vulnerabilities at the moment?
Yeah, I think in terms of the broad dynamics, one of the things that has been true for a while is that the actual kind of actors creating false and misleading content, with a malicious intent to sort of spread and influence people and what have you. That's a small amount of people still. And granted, you may have foreign governments. Obviously, there have been, very valid concerns about Chinese sponsored interference and influence operations targeting Canadians, Russian ones targeting Canadians, Iranian ones targeting Canadians. And so absolutely, there are state actors who are trying to do that. There are other actors who are doing it to make money. And it might be that they're using the image of a politician to try and get you into a crypto scam, which is probably one of the most common ones all of us interact with, to be honest, right? Celebrity, a politician, or what have you. And so there are, these sort of actors. It's often it's politics, it's self-interest, it's money, those types of motivations. And the dynamic is that things may kind of originate with them, but where it actually can potentially reach the most amount of people and have its most influence is when well-meaning people see it, believe it, or just, are interested enough in it to engage with it and to pass it on and share it or act with it in other ways. And that's sort of the relationship between, the disinformation, the intentional creation, spreading of this stuff, and the misinformation, which is those of us, we encounter it, we don't necessarily see it for what it is and might pass it along and share it or just look at it and engage with it. And, so that dynamic plays out a lot. And the way things get more to the sort of more mass appeal is typically from well-meaning folks, people in our lives, or, in bad scenarios where journalists fall for it or don't realize the nature of this information and the origins of it. And we treat it as authentic when perhaps it hasn't sprung from purely authentic places. So that's those are sort of a dynamic that we see a lot. And, the folks creating and spreading this stuff, sure, sometimes they can put it in an ad and reach people directly with that. But a lot of times they're really hoping for that organic engagement, which again goes back to all of our responsibility is like, when we fall for something and spread something that's misleading or not true, there's the part for us about how it affects us. But in this networked environment, we give oxygen to that information. Right. And just by looking at it, even if we don't share it, just by stopping on TikTok or on a video in Facebook or YouTube or whatever, just by stopping and watching it, that has sent a signal to the platform that, oh, Craig engaged with this. And that might cause them to give me more stuff like that. But it also might them say, well, if Craig liked this, maybe I'll show it to other people like Craig because they might also spend time on it. Because at the end of the day, that's what they want. They want us spending time on the platform. And so that dynamic of like the human behavior, all the way from the sort of original bad actor to well-meaning people, to that colliding with this big system that chooses what to sort of give attention to and not, that's the chain reaction that we see happening. And, for Canada, you asked about our environment. I mean, one of the things that's the dynamic that I think is really sort of interesting and problematic right now is, for example, Meta does not allow people to share links to news content and news organizations in Canada. This is over a dispute with the, Trudeau era Liberals bill and all of that. And so, so that obviously deprives people of certain information from credible outlets. But what it does is it creates a vacuum and an opportunity for other people to sort of come in. And so, what's happening in some cases, like on some other platforms, some of the platforms out there, whether it's Meta or not, it's also on TikTok, you might have Americans who are talking about Canadian politics who are suddenly like their content may get more engagement in Canada than before. And people who are not sort of producing content that comes out in links, which is often what mainstream media does, they're the ones who can often get engagement. So that's where influencers and other types of actors, may be able to get more eyes and more engagement than before, or actors that are not actually a news organization, but are still putting out news-like content. They may not be subject to the ban, but they get to, and because of that, they get to sort of be there and fill the space. And that's a dynamic that I think a lot of academics and people are looking at and wondering, what is that going to look like for this election?
It's quite interesting because I think we're starting to ask new questions than we were asking even, a year or two before. So, number one, I appreciate that you identified the inability to access traditional legacy media on these platforms that have our attention and the attention economy. And then I also wonder about, what about the information overwhelm and how many Canadians are actually being a news avoidant at the moment? I think that was actually something that was quite novel that came up at the panel that I met you at, that Abacus Data shared some really interesting data points around.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really, this is a trend that sort of continues to sort of increase, I think, in Canada and the US, which is that the amount of people who will say in surveys that they are feeling kind of overwhelmed by the news and their reaction to it is to pull back. I mean, I have family members who have told me like, yeah, I'm just trying to avoid as much of it as possible for my own sanity and mental health, right? And so this element of news avoidance, of people consciously making an effort to reduce or as much as possible eliminate their interactions with or their conscious consumption of news as they understand it, is definitely a trend. And what's really kind of interesting about that is, that tends to sort of affect most your sort of mainstream traditional, very recognizable things as news. So like TV or, news websites or newspaper websites, that kind of thing. People know, oh yeah, that's news. But when it comes to them watching videos on YouTube, or them consuming influencer videos on TikTok, I mean, in a lot of cases like that will often have similar news type content, but
Mhm.
perception wise they may not feel that it is. And so it's a really interesting dynamic, and this goes to the elements of kind of trust and perception around news and information right now, which is, we overall are, as Canadians, are losing trust in our institutions. This is a trend that's happening in a lot of Western democracies. Lost a lot of trust in the media, but also it's true for sort of politicians, parliament, business, that kind of thing. And maybe, maybe that trust data was a bit overstated at the time or what have you. But it's interesting that as trust in those kinds of things decline, what people tend to sort of grab onto are things that feel familiar or close or more authentic, meaning one person talking to a camera who's not saying, I'm a journalist, so you need to trust me, who's just like, hey, I was out today and I heard this and I heard that. And it's like you relate because like they look like me. They're talking like me. And so some of the trust, I think, is in some ways conferred onto people who give sort of news like content, but not in a news package. And so people think they're avoiding the news, but I think they're still getting some information and they're still using it to form their worldviews. And my opinion isn't that, all influencers are inferior to mainstream media. Like I welcome a much more open media environment, but I also think like if we're not consciously saying I'm getting news in that moment, we may not be judging it the way we judge it when it comes from CTV or somebody else. And it's a
Right.
different kind of consumption. And this is an area I would love to see more study about, is like, do people sort of question more and engage a different part of their brain as they consume what they consider to be news versus stuff that they don't think is news, but actually has similar types of informational content.
I think that's a really interesting question to ask, and then really kind of grounding that in the responsibility that if you decide to be one of those people who are distilling and helping share news, are you really acting with that responsibility and with some form of journalistic ethics in mind, right?
Yeah, I would love to see, without, because sometimes those of us who work in the media, it seems like we're wagging our finger at people who aren't in sort of a traditional role, right? And that's not the place that I want to be, because I think people should be able to get news in lots of different ways. And I think people should be able to participate in the production and sharing of news and keep that open. But finding a way to create a culture of kind of ethics and responsibility so that people do acknowledge that they have some responsibility is like would be a really good starting point. I mean, you look at like arguably the biggest podcaster in the world, Joe Rogan. I mean, there's no question that people consider his podcast to be a source of news. He has people on who are talking about health and politics and all. It is absolutely engaging with news and information. But he, in terms of his approach, and he has a whole staff of how they prepare for these interviews, they don't seem to sort of feel a responsibility to be like, okay, let's prepare. Let's make sure that when we talk to this person, we've gotten a good grounding so we can, get good information out, but also know if perhaps they've gone a bit off the rails. I think for him, it's just like, well, we're just going to have a conversation. But there's a level of responsibility there that is tremendous, which doesn't seem to be fully embraced.
I would agree with that. I think recently he had a more conservative guest on. I'm failing to remember their name right now, who actually pushed back about, you're not just asking questions, you're going in with knowing that certain things are abjectly untrue, but still giving voice, platform, and attention to them. So I think this is an interesting one
Mm-hmm.
we're going to have to keep working on. When it comes to that intention, that responsibility, I do want to talk about the platforms a little bit. I am wondering, with the current environment in the US, as difficult as it is, and Meta specifically rolling back some fact checking and replacing them with community notes. I'm just wondering to what extent you find that have found that effective. And what are some avenues potentially for doing this
Mhm.
in a very difficult political environment?
Yeah, and I think number one, for the sake of the platforms, I will acknowledge, this is it's a very big challenge again with the scale that they operate to really effectively oversee and moderate the content. Now that I've given them, a little bit of credit on that, it is important to also remember, like nobody forced Meta and TikTok and others to get as big as they are and be in every country that they're in and have as many users and as much content being, posted every day. They have chosen for financial reasons and other reasons to try to achieve as much scale as they can. And with that comes a lot of challenges for actually, overseeing and enforcing their policies around it. And for me, Meta, it's interesting because like I remember with Facebook, being there and sort of looking at that evolution between about 2010 and the end of 2016, where as they tried to do more with news, there was just so much stuff that was good, but also what the platform ended up rewarding was stuff that was more extreme, often misleading, totally false, that kind of stuff. And then at the end of 2016, they have a massive change and they say, hey, look, we didn't take our responsibility seriously. And they make a huge investment really over the next like 8, 9 years in this area. And the Meta is showing up at journalism conferences. Meta is talking about everything it's doing in this area. And they did a lot. Like they absolutely changed a lot of things and they started working with fact checkers. And then basically in the last year or two, it's been kind of a retrenchment. And we've seen layoffs on these trust and safety teams that are responsible for overseeing and enforcing these policies, not just at Meta, but at other places as well. And so for me, the change for Meta, for example, to sort of say in the US, we're going to stop working with fact checkers to help identify content that's false so we can label it for users. And instead, we're going to adopt the model that Elon Musk has really pushed at X, which is community notes, which basically means anyone can sign up to be part of the community notes program. And then what you're able to do within the system is to kind of look at things that people have submitted as a proposed note on a tweet or on a Facebook post saying, hey, there's inaccurate information in here. Here's a link. Here's the context. And if enough people in the community notes program, and this is one of the key things about it, enough people from different points of view, so sort of right and left, agree that, yes, this is a valid note, then it eventually gets added to the system. And so I think crowdsourced fact checking systems like that are really interesting and they are things that platforms should be investing in. The main problem, I think, is that they aren't investing in them to the degree they need to. You need to actually have lots of people from lots of places and lots of points of views and lots of different, other types of experience and what have you participating and really participating. And that takes a hell of a lot of effort to get people to do things. Otherwise, you end up with very motivated partisans and other people who basically battle it out in your community note system, which means a lot of valid notes never get applied. And so you're going to be slow and you're going to miss tons of stuff. And that's going to be ultimately ineffective. And so for me, I think Meta choosing to bring that in, certainly I think them saying we're getting rid of these biased US fact checkers had definitely had political overtones to it. They threw these fact checkers that they've been working with now for almost a decade under the bus. And what would have been great is actually if they had done both and said, we're going to see how the professionals and this sort of passionate community notes, community members can together actually reach more scale and do a better job. And so I think it's a huge missed opportunity. And I really worry that Meta is just going to treat the community notes as a bit of a fig leaf and not invest in it and grow it to the extent where it really can be effective. And right now is probably the worst time because the fact checkers are gone and community notes is just getting started. So there is very little happening in this area right now, at least in the US where they've started this.
But I think that's a really interesting point that this actually provides an opportunity for greater connection and conversation and really allowing for the postmodern view of truth in some ways, that people have perspectives and that people have their own truths and integrating that with more kind of hard fact checking. So I think that's a really interesting
Mm-hmm.
takeaway for today. I
Mm-hmm.
want to focus a little bit on how journalism is responding to meet this moment. Um, how do you think traditional media, which we see in a growing erasure of local news, which I think is kind of the forefront of truth, right? Like when we're in community together, you and I can see that we're in front of each other. We can see that certain cars are passing by on the road. That's a very simple example, but I do think that's like the bedrock of truth, right? So
Mm.
I am just wondering, how is journalism evolving and innovating and adapting so they can stay so they can survive and stay relevant.
I mean, they're trying. We're trying.
Yeah.
Look, I mean, it's funny because for me, again, to go back to like 2004, I launched a blog because at that time it seemed like there were so many opportunities for the future of journalism, and journalism are going to change for the better. And I was excited about it. And I remained excited for a long time. And I'm starting to find it difficult to be optimistic about it. And look, at the core of this is a business model challenge that exists for the news
Right.
business. And so, the reality is that I keep mentioning it, but like Facebook now, Meta, and Google, like they came up with a different type of digital advertising that basically has hoovered up most of the digital advertising revenue that's available out there. Those two companies dominate the digital advertising ecosystem, which is about $1 trillion a year. And so what happened was with that, plus things like Craigslist, which started to take away the classified ad revenue for newspapers, basically the financial underpinning where owning and running a newspaper in the 20th century was a really good business. Running a broadcaster for the latter half of the 20th century was a really good business. And they are not good businesses anymore. And the media industry and the news industry have not found anything to replace that revenue and that model that comes close to supporting the number of journalists that it did. And so one way the news industry is trying to respond is to try to figure out new business models, new ways of making money. And then another way is that there really is a big movement, has been within the news industry to actually tackle this issue of trust. There's a project called Trusting News run by a woman named Joy Mayer. There's the Trust Project, which is run also in the US. And they've been doing research and working with newsrooms trying to figure out how do we build a better relationship with our communities and with the people that we're trying to serve? How do we not be seen as separate from them and this faceless institution of the media? And how do we actually find ways to engage? And I think, here in Toronto, where we are, there's a news startup called The Green Line, which does a lot around community and not just reporting, but they do things with and for the community that they serve. And so there are efforts to do that. And I'm with you 100% that like the local news piece is where we need to figure this out. One, because they've been hit hardest by the death of that business model. And two, because to your point, that is where the face-to-face interaction and the understanding of like, yes, they're journalists, they work in my community, they also have kids in the same soccer team. Just that understanding where journalists are not seen as a faceless national entity or a bad actor is really important. And again, as you pointed out, it's like they will see things they know about in the local paper and they can make a really good judge of that. And that helps make the journalism better and it helps people have a better connection to it. So there's efforts, we're trying, but it is a significant business challenge. And in addition to the fact that there are really, at this point, very much, there are political parties and well-motivated actors who see them benefiting from undermining trust in the media and the news overall as well. And so they make that sort of part of their efforts because lessening trust and attention to news media, they think means more people coming to them without that filter.
That's really helpful. And I'll say two things. So number one, I love that you gave a shout out to Anita from the Green Line, who does really such extraordinary work. And
Yes.
then also wanted to share that, our other good friends at Public Policy Forum have just put out a really amazing report on local journalism and done a whole granting system with the Rideau Hall Foundation and I believe the Michener Foundation as well. So I think that's another thing, right? Having the foundations and people who are invested
Yes.
in this greater level of responsibility and the survival of news to really just put dollars behind it too, right?
Absolutely. And it shouldn't just be, we're just going to give you money. It should be, let's give you money. Let's figure out how we build something sustainable. And that's the key thing. And I think, a lot of the granting programs are trying to figure out how to do that is, because the money isn't going to be there forever. And in Canada, we don't have massive foundations interested in this area yet either. And so figuring out what is a sustainable model is really, really important because you can't do the journalism, you can't serve the community if you can't hire anyone and have the jobs there. So it's tough though. Yeah.
Exactly. And I think we saw the Globe announce an initiative as well today too. So I would say to the audience, look out for that as well. I want to ask you one more question, and then we have some great questions coming in the chat. So I would encourage anybody else who wants to ask Craig a question to weigh in. But maybe it's a little bit more personal. So In a time when even verified facts are constantly dismissed, how are you proving or trying to prove something is true? And what's it like doing investigative journalism when people doubt not just the story, but the whole idea of truth itself?
Yeah, or they just fundamentally doubt journalism overall, right?
Hmm.
As a delivery mechanism or as an institution. I think for those of us who are sort of doing the journalism, if we are up there with these very important but existential questions, it's hard for us to just sort of get down and do the work. And so I think for a lot of people and for me, it's like number one, I have to just do the best work that I can, because if I do it at a high quality, that's one thing where it can't be undermined at that level, at least, in a genuine way. But I think the second thing that I think about, and a lot of news organizations think about, is how do we show our work? We cannot just assume that because we write for this place or it's been published here, that people are going to believe it and accept it. Which is maybe in some ways like a silver lining around this,
I would
where,
agree with that.
right, like we can't just be like, well, I'm a journalist, so you have to believe what I said. I mean, that leads to certain arrogance. It can lead to sloppiness. It's not a healthy way to approach this type of work, which is fraught with mistakes and wrong turns. And so thinking about, well, how is somebody, imagining that it's very skeptical reader of like, how do I show and walk them through a process of how I found these things? And if I got a bunch of documents and if I have a bunch of evidence and it's visual and I can include that in the story so they can see it and read it for themselves. Here is 200 pages of the records requests we did, and you can read them right here, and you can see us highlighting the things that we've included in our story. The more that we can sort of be almost as if we're opening it up and saying, here, take a look at how we did this. Take a look at what we found, and you can make up your mind and also judge how we've presented it. So the idea of kind of showing your receipts is something that I think about, and I think a lot of newsrooms are trying to do. And to also, talk a little bit about the process of how this comes together, because one of the things that journalists are still trying to understand and fully grapple with is that we assumed for a long time that people understood how we do what we do and how we go about our jobs. They assumed when we had a source in a story who was, we didn't identify and they were an anonymous source, we assumed that people understood, oh, that's because there's some sensitivity and the reporter knows who they are, but they've agreed not to name them in order to have this information in there. Well, it turns out most people don't understand it to be that. In some cases, people believe that it means even the journalist doesn't know who that anonymous source is, that somebody just gave us information and we printed it or what have you. And so, we have to challenge a lot of the assumptions we've had
Interesting.
about just by default earning that trust, and that people understand how we do what we do. And so that element of trying, without boring people, making the process more transparent, sharing what we know, how we went about finding it, giving people the option to look at it for themselves. Those are things that I think a lot of people, particularly in investigative work, are thinking like, how do I show them all of the fruits of what I found and what I collected to do this story?
That's really helpful. Thank you, Craig. And so we have a couple really amazing questions coming in from our audience. And I just want to say to the audience that if we run out of time, we will answer the question. We'll write to you with the answer, but we're going to try to make this a bit rapid fire so we can answer all of them. Okay, so this is coming in from Sarah, who is looking for advice on concrete tactics that local governments can use to increase trust with the public, help increase willingness to look at us as a source of truth or information related to our community instead of conspiracy theories or mis and disinformation, and really increase willingness to engage on a range of topics. I think this is a very hard question. So I think we can
Yeah.
try and sort it out.
Yeah, no, it is. It's a hard question. There isn't one simple, easy answer. And obviously the trust element where it's decreased in media a little bit. Obviously, I'm sure at the local government level, this person has probably seen it as well, right? And seeing people not trusting what's come from the government and trying to look in other places. And I think, some of what I just said about how journalists are trying to sort of grapple with this may relate as well, which is, maybe this sort of, just because it's from the government pronouncement, we can't assume that that's enough anymore, right? And so then the question is with the communication that comes out, are you explaining why a decision has been taken? Are you making available the materials that led to the decision? making government transparent in terms of, recording local meetings or things like that? Are you making it so that, there is a chain of sort of evidence and decision making and other things that people can look at and be like, okay, so I do want to nerd out on this and read it, and I can. And it's not just, oh, the government has said this and they haven't explained to us why. And this, I think, is one of the things that, people might get frustrated at times is a decision is made, and unless you were nerding out and watching the local council meetings or what have you, you have no idea that there's been 6 months of debate and reports from staff to council and all that kind of stuff. And so I would just say, like, as a starting point, what can you do to sort of show the work and show the effort that's been there? But then also, how can you as a government have, dialogue with people and enable them to ask questions and find ways to get meaningful answers and invite them to come and talk. And I realize sometimes that's tough because you might have organized groups that come in and want to swamp the whole thing, but to shrink away is to seed the ground. And so I would think about those lessons of transparency and engagement of, like, how is it not just an announcement, but actually something that you've built up to over time in sharing information, and something that has a whole package of things that sort of helps people understand why this has taken place or why this information is coming out now.
Thank you for helping Sarah with that. And if I would just add one thing, I would also say, in my opinion, governments just really need to get back to making sure essential services work and work well. I think we see a lot of complaints across the kind of public ecosystem, and I've seen them having worked for the public service myself, is that people feel that things don't work, that forms online, that IT is faulty, that all these things, and the amount of frustration and the way that trust is broken so quickly there and so difficult, and is so difficult to restore. I think that really getting back to that brass tacks is a huge piece. We have another question that's come in from Mark. So given your analysis, Craig, what is your opinion about how much engagement and sense making with people about facts and truth can or should be online, and how much will it depend on us reconnecting with people personally and in person in better, more effective face-to-face forums? He says, I must admit that I can't muster any significant online engagement nowadays, given how wickedly difficult it is to have a decent exchange.
Yeah, I can relate.
To
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think so many people can. And at the end of the day, there is so much that does end up getting lost, like little visual cues and nonverbal cues when we're trying to engage with somebody online. And sure, maybe you can have a video call, but even then it's not the same. And so, I mean, one of the pieces of advice that I've been giving for more than 10 years now is, as much as possible, yeah, can you actually have a conversation that is offline? Jumping in on a big group debate, if it's not in a framework and a format in a community that is used to having those and is dedicated to having those in a productive kind of way, it's going to be very energy sapping and disappointing, right? And so I really encourage people, like, for example, at a small level, if you're in a family group chat or a group of friends or somebody posts something on Facebook, and it's not true, or it's really over the line or what have you, engaging in a public back and forth with them is only going to get their back up and make them feel like they're being attacked. Even if you think about what's the most polite, nice way I can say, hey, I think you might be mistaken here, take a look at this link. There is a natural reaction, regardless of how you approach, where the person feels like they're being challenged or dismissed or what have you. And so the best thing is often to, like, at the very least, try to DM and go direct to them if you know them and you have a relationship, to talk about that and get on the phone or get in person and talk about it. But the other thing I would just say is, don't set the bar so high that you disappoint yourself. You're not going to change somebody's mind in an online discussion, very rarely, or even in the in-person discussion, right? And this is one of the things with fact checkers, is like, there's like all this debate of, like, does fact checking even work? And it's like, well, if you're expecting somebody to read one fact check and then change their opinion completely about something they really believe deeply, then no, that's not going to happen. But we shouldn't expect a fact check to do that. There's a whole range of people that would find the information helpful and it works for them. So it's the same thing in these scenarios. If you can engage, even if it's not in person, one-on-one with them, and don't come into it thinking I'm going to change their mind. Think about, how do I understand more about where this person found this and what they're talking about and why they might be presenting it this way? Because it's very hard to understand how to have that conversation unless you take the steps to start of understanding where they got this and where they're coming from. So it's sort of like one-on-one or in person, and first start with listening rather than challenging, and then the opportunities to actually have a dialogue
I
present
think that's really
themselves.
helpful, Craig. And I think it'd be really interesting, and maybe someone has done it, is to interview the woman who was one of the January 6th insurrectionists who actually rejected her pardon when it came because she'd had time to think about her life, her views, her
Right.
investment in conspiracy theories, and actually chart that behavioral change. But I feel like that's another conversation for another time. So at this point, I actually want to hand things over to my incredible colleague, Catherine Corriveau, who is here from the Exchange. Craig, I wanted to say thank you so much for your time and your attention, to the audience as well. Kat's going to provide a little bit of commentary and then a couple calls to action for us as well. Kat, over to you.
Thank you. And thank you, Victoria. Thank you, Craig, for these really powerful insights. I think sometimes it's easy to get lost in the negative thinking. And I am coming out of this call actually feeling a bit more hopeful and excited about, avenues where we can all move towards as a society and a community engaged in these issues. I just want to share some quick thoughts. For us at the Democratic Engagement Exchange, we're very committed to not just talking about the issues and doing problem identification, but really thinking about the solutions and how us as an organization, but more broadly, us as a community working in this space, we can empower each other and equip each other to deal with these challenges. And one of the ways that we do this is by convening these conversations, but also through our event that's coming up in May, the Canadian Vote Summit, where we're going to be focusing mostly on solutions and really ensuring that people are attending an event where they'll be able to come out of it with tools, with new practices, with new ideas, and sort of a new frame of assessment for a lot of the challenges that we all face in our own way. From getting sort of insights from public affairs campaign experts who are going to teach us how to communicate with Canadians, how to do it in an engaging way, to hearing from chief electoral officers who have been implementing changes to their Elections Act to be addressing some of these sort of challenges around mis and disinformation and sort of media ecosystem campaigns to impact democracy, to using some tools like AI as a method to really create pathways for participation and engagement. We're going to have two really fun and engaging keynotes as well, who are going to break down some of these challenges, but in the context of the different societies we live in and the communities we create. So we have Hari Han and Richard Reeves. They're both excellent sort of thinkers in this space. So I welcome everyone who's here to check out the information about the Canadian Vote Summit. We hope to see people from across the country. We really will have a representation from coast to coast to coast. And you're all welcome as not just participants listening in to that event, but really participants and experts contributing to the solutions that we build together as a community. We can only do so much, and we really rely on everyone being sort of the experts in their own way. And so we welcome you to come as experts and contributors, and as people who can help us rethink the way that we do the work that we do. So thank you so much to both of you. We hope to see many of you in Montreal, May 20th and 21st. It's right after the long weekend. It's always really beautiful outside in Montreal. Excited to meet those who will be able to attend. But thank you
Thanks.
all for being here.
Thanks so much, Kat. Thanks so much, Craig. And thank you to our incredible audience today. One question we'll leave you with: if the truth isn't dead, then what are we all going to do to keep protecting it? See you next time.